Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Stronger with Time. I'm your host, Tony Butaji. This week's guest was Dr. Alyssa Olenick. Doc Lys holds a PhD in exercise physiology and is one of the rare scientists to exclusively study women. She is also a lifelong athlete, having competed in sports as long as ultramarathons, high rocks, and strength activities as well. The reason why I wanted to talk to Doc Lys is that I think she puts out some of the best female-oriented fitness advice on social media, full stop. In this conversation, we talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to fitness advice for females. We applied this to how to find research, how to know whether it's good information, and looked at that in respect to Zone 2 exercise and strength training. Without further delay, please enjoy this conversation with Doc Lys. Doc Lys, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
You are extremely popular in the fitness world for giving great fitness advice, but also dealing with the rubbish that comes out that women are bombarded with every day. How did it all start for you in this world of science and fitness, especially for women?
Yeah. So the Cliff Notes version is I grew up an athlete. I trained hard. I was obsessed with being an athlete. All I cared about was being an athlete. And then I got to college and I kind of accidentally realized I was good at school and I started to quickly fall in love with science. And I got through my undergrad and into my master's where I started doing research on women before I ever really realized that there was like these research gaps. I didn't know this. I luckily never realized that was an obstacle for me as a female athlete. I just had never even thought about it. And then I started my master's and I was being mentored by a woman who partnered with another woman, and they were doing a lot of pregnancy research, and they brought me in on to do some women's related research with that. And that's where I started to realize like, okay, there's these gaps, or this isn't really well researched, or there's, oh my gosh, there's this whole world of women that aren't being studied or included in studies and all of this stuff. So I actually have the track record of never doing a study that doesn't involve women in any of the research projects that I've done the whole way through, which I'm pretty proud of. But essentially, I love sport. I love fitness. I was obsessed with it, but I didn't really want to go the strength and conditioning route as much as I was like, I really care about people's metabolic health and well-being and longevity and all that stuff. So I went a little bit more the metabolism exercise intersection route. And so when I finished my master's, I started my PhD at the University of Georgia, and I brought with me that postprandial metabolism intersection of exercise and women-based studies to my lab. And luckily, I actually had like an underfunded lab. So my PI was like, if you have ideas with the equipment that we have, with whatever grants that you can get, you can kind of do whatever you want. So I had a lot of creative freedom as a scientist. And I kind of came in and I was like, I want to research women. He said, okay, if you can give me the rationalization of how, why we're going to do it, good science plausibility for what we're going to do, you can do whatever you want. And so I just dove into that field and that world through that. And of course, throughout all of this, I'm growing a business focused on exercise, training, running, hybrid training, lifting, all of that stuff, because I myself still consider myself an athlete. But what I realized through the intersection of all this is that women want to train hard, but they've never been exposed to sport. They've never been exposed to like more deliberate fitness training, or they've only been sold like fat loss or dieting focused or becoming thinner focused fitness goals. And they've never really been given the option of anything else. And so I really doubled down not only in my messaging, but also my coaching and training, and showing people that like these messages that women are fragile or they can't train hard or have big goals or we're incapable of them. It's just like, one, it's not founded by any research or data, or two, like, have you ever watched a sport in your entire life? Have you ever gotten off TikTok and watched any female athlete do anything? Like, we are so capable of so many things. And I think a lot of women, they don't see that. And so I really wanted to not just bridge that gap of what I was doing in the lab and what I was learning and researching, but what I was training for ultra marathons and still lifting heavy and winning weightlifting competitions. And I wanted to show women that like, that's what their physiology is capable of. And so I try to like really marry and bridge those things together, because I hated seeing, because I feel like a lot of those messages started to come out a lot in my PhD and postdoc time. And I'm like, why do we have this narrative that we're fragile and weak? Like, none of the data that I've seen as I started to, research it more and read in a packet supports that at all. And so I really kind of made it my mission and my fight, alongside just like good general exercise physiology education, to show women that they're really capable of doing amazing things. They don't have to run ultra marathons or win powerlifting meets, but they still in their own regards can have very serious goals and train hard, and or the things that like you do to train hard are actually probably the best things to do for health or longevity or metabolic like health and all of those things along the way. So that's how I got to what I'm doing here today. There's just this big intersection of my own passion for fitness, sport, and athleticism with the research and the science behind it.
Let me touch upon two of the points you've raised there. And the first is gaps in research. I think a lot of the public are blown away when they realize that scientists haven't answered every question yet. And every time you read a scientific paper, there's a section at the end that says, here are the limitations, this is the new direction, and these are things that we don't know yet. So scientists know there's gaps all over the place when it comes to our field of exercise science.
Yeah.
But that's really been made a big deal of
Mm-hmm.
in social media that we don't know anything. And this
Yeah.
leads to your second point, and that is, well, women really are fragile around certain times of the menstrual cycle or around menopause, and therefore you need very unique training recommendations. Let's look at the good and the bad and the ugly when it comes to female fitness advice. And rather than doing that in order and look at the good advice, the bad advice, and then just the crazy misinformation, let's do it related to the different components of fitness that would make up a well-rounded program.
Yeah.
And before we do that, how do we know whether advice is good or not? Because women really are bombarded with different advice and they are confused. But often a lot of the confusion is coming from either females with great physique, so it must work for them, or their doctors, either medical doctors or their PhDs. And you think, well, they're using science, so it has to be true. How can a female know whether they're getting good advice or not? Where does it come from?
Yeah, I think this is the hardest thing online right now. And I actually really sympathize for women. And if anyone follows me or comes to my page, is why I try to really double down on like the nuance of things, because I want women to actually understand why they should think the way they should think, or like help them sharpen their bullshit detectors kind of things. Because I think sometimes if one person's saying one thing and one person's saying the other, and they're like, people don't have the knowledge to link together where those things are coming from. So I really think that, for one, anyone who's speaking in absolutes, and it's really like an absolute that sounds really flashy and scary, or they're using such complex jargon that you don't understand even how to understand what they're saying, that you think it must be true. Just take a second to pause. That doesn't mean anyone who uses big words is bad. Sometimes I get called out on speaking too sciencey in my stuff, and I really work on that. But if it's so confusing and so scary, and or leaves you not feeling like you have an answer, or there's just one absolute concrete must be 100% solution to something, that's usually a chance to just dig a little bit deeper and ask why, how, who says, what, for what reason, kind of thing. And I think that that's what's happening, though, is we're all editing these podcast clips that are meant to market these podcasts to get clicks and views, but they go viral, and no one either listens to that full conversation or goes and listens to other conversations of other experts who might be saying something different. They're not getting the breadth and the depth of that conversation. They're just kind of getting the tea, not the crossing of the tea, like the shallow level stuff, and not the depth. So I understand why women are so confused. And so usually I think if people are speaking in very strong absolutes, they're really leaning into something that sounds scary, or you're insecure about, or you feel, oh, wow, there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. I'm different. I'm fragile, or whatever it is. Those are usually times to pause and ask those questions of why, how, what data is saying that. And that's hard, where I think we're seeing this happen right now in the social media space, where certain people are using data and it's not good data, or it's not the strongest data, or it's not the most conclusive data. And I get why I sympathize with women, why they don't understand what to believe, because one person's saying X and one person's saying Y, and they don't understand Z. And I think that's really hard, where I think that's where you start to follow multiple people who say multiple things. And there's going to be people like you and me who say very similar things in different ways, but we're probably agreeing on 90% of the same stuff. And if you start following enough people, you're going to start to see that the experts mostly agree on most of the same things. And those people who are saying those fringe things, they start to sound more and more like outliers, because you start to hear so much of that same messaging. But sometimes if you're in that like TikTok funnel of the same messaging over and over again, like expand your algorithm to even different views and perspectives, because it will start making you think, well, maybe that isn't the only thing, because you're just going to keep getting fed the same thing over and over and over again, especially if you keep clicking on it. So maybe just try to like take that step back and follow more experts. And that's where it's tricky, because people with doctors and PhDs are saying a lot of the confusing stuff. But start to notice trends. of what most of those people are saying and start from there, and don't take anything even that I say at face value. If I post something and you want to say how, why, with what data, ask that. That's totally okay to ask professionals, and they should be able to back that or explain that to you. And if you notice a lot of the like influencers posting a lot of the confusing stuff, if you read their post and caption, I get on their pages and like, you're not saying anything. They're just saying a lot of buzzwords and confusing words and things that sound flashy, but they're never actually telling you anything of substance. And when you come across those pages, I would just swipe to the next thing, right? Like if they're not giving you anything of substance to actually build on or understand or apply, and they're just kind of scaring you into their ecosystem, that's probably a good chance to just move on to something else.
And I think some of the underlying research is what people don't quite get. It's mechanistic, or it's sex differences in biology. And then that's being taken that you therefore need to do something different. Maybe let's double down on that so we can really help a confused woman understand, should I go for a long run or should I do some sprint training? And this, you'll hear the best for a woman around menopause is to do sprinting. And there'll be science, and you'll look at the science. And what I'll often tell people in my circles is, well, just look at that data. Did it compare pre and post menopause, or did it compare males and females and they measured an outcome? Or was it because women are better fat burners and that's why they need to do more sprinting? So it's understanding the difference between a mechanism and an outcome. So let's do that with endurance training. You are an endurance runner. Perhaps let us know some of the feats you've done endurance wise.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not by any means super impressive when it comes to flat speed. I always get that. So I got to get that disclaimer. We're working on it. But I've ran over 17 ultra marathons. Last year, I ran my first 100 miler. I'm training for my first road marathon. I did 3 high roxes this year. I've kind of become known as the female cardio girly, like the girl with the pitchfork of defending cardio for women in the online space. But I grew up a runner. I've always ran my entire life. I love it. And I think it's totally safe and fine for women to do.
And there's 2 arguments against that for women, isn't there? There's, well, if you do it at a certain time of the day before breakfast, or if you do it too hard, you're going to raise cortisol, and cortisol will have a cascade of negative effects. Or there's, because you're a female and you have different fiber types and different metabolism, you should only do this type of cardio. So let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to endurance training. And firstly, why would anyone ever do it anyway? Because you'll hear another argument, and that is, well, all you need is muscle mass and you should just be lifting weights.
Yeah. So I find it funny for anyone here who's not familiar with me. I've become known as the running cardio girl, but I am traditionally a beefcake. I am made for power and strength. I lift a lot. I have a lot of muscle. Like, I think sometimes people think that I'm anti-lifting, and I'm like, just take 1 second and just pause there, because I am so pro lifting and muscle and strength and power. And I think that those things are so fundamentally important. But I think the fitness industry took this big hyper swing, and we're seeing this in the female phys space, where people were so endurance, cardio, running in the early 2000s, or honestly, a lot of original exercise physiology was really just endurance focused, right? Strength training has really become more popular in the last few decades of research. You know, there's just always was such an emphasis on that we've hypercorrected to like muscle, strength, power, hypertrophy, like women's specific fitness is just strength training and stuff like that. And it's totally neglecting this really fundamental, important component of our health and longevity, and that is your aerobic fitness status. I mean, we have some robust data that shows associations between VO2 max and just general aerobic fitness status and capacity on reducing death risk or mortality or longevity, or its associations with components of metabolic health, insulin resistance, or I did a lot of my dissertation work on metabolic flexibility, or just like being metabolically healthy. And I think that we often overlook that because people think, well, muscle, I'm building muscle, so it's going to improve my metabolism. Like, yeah, that's building the car, but we need to like refine the engine is the way that I like to think about it. And so when we see in women, they have greater lifetime increased risk of metabolic and cardiovascular disease. I think, why are we telling the population that's lifetime risk is greater, even if, you know, it shifts across from pre to postmenopause a little bit more with a higher risk in the postmenopausal state, to avoid the one mode of activity that we know is strongly associated with those things. Of course, knowing that resistance training and lifting is important too. People always say, which one would you recommend over the other? And I would say neither. That's a bad question, but I favor doing enough resistance training to build muscle and strength and being as much generally active and doing as much general cardio as you can, just because we know that that's really volume dependent and or intensity dependent or just really important for our metabolic health. So I kind of have that little bit of a bias with also noting that like lift, do the heavy stuff, lift too, but like you don't need to spend 6 days a week in the gym, right? Like sometimes you need to shift that time to just not be sedentary is more so like the point that I'm trying to make here. But we want to do cardio for our health. We want to do it because we want to improve mitochondrial density and efficiency. We want to improve insulin sensitivity. We want to stress our vascular system, our heart, and all of these things in tissues that lifting does positively contribute to, but just not to the same magnitude as endurance training. I think people get lost on that a lot. They're like, well, lifting has these benefits. Yeah, there's overlapping benefits, but the magnitude is different. Running up hills will possibly improve muscle strength and power in somebody who's detrained, but not to the same way that like back squats are going to. And it's the same thing in reverse. And so I really hate these messages that they tell women to avoid cardio because it's either cortisol or belly fat. Or it's destroying your hormones. And those conversations, again, this is a great kind of BS detector to like post in content for people for looking at these things, is they tell you these things that are slightly in some ways correct enough, but they're not giving you the nuance and the layers behind when or why these things become problematic for women, so to speak. So like a lot of women on the surface level, they see, well, I was doing a bunch of HIIT classes and it didn't work. I didn't lose weight. I felt inflamed. I felt swollen. I felt puffy. I felt terrible. And then I stopped and I cycle synced. And then they're not acknowledging the fact that a lot of these influencers telling them this were in low energy availability, or they were just overtraining and not balancing high and low intensity, or factoring recovery, or eating in a way that supported what they were doing. They were just frying themselves every day. Yeah, if a man does that too, he's going to feel terrible. That's not female specific. That's just bad training, right? But they don't share that layer of things behind it. And so I know I'm getting off on a side note here. I'm sorry. Tangent, but like women need endurance or cardio training. Now, whether you fall on that spectrum of just doing enough cardio to function, meet the exercise guidelines, exist day to day, be healthy enough, versus I have specific training goals will differ. And you can decide that. I think that there's also this confusion that people assume that like doing cardio means everyone has to train for a marathon, and it doesn't mean that at all. But there's also so many messages out here that are making women afraid, especially midlife women who have been endurance athletes their entire life, thinking that they aren't capable of doing that. And that's just not true. And so, yeah, anyway, I'm the pro endurance girly, so to speak, but I really think that like, if a page is telling you to avoid cardiovascular activity, they are putting you at risk of impacting your health negatively. And that is a massive red flag of I shouldn't probably listen to this page or person, because they're not telling me how to adjust it to make it more appropriate. They're telling me to avoid it. And anything that tells you to avoid any form of just like generalized activity is probably not giving you good information. So we'll round it back in.
That's a great point, because a good coach can work around any issue, whether it's you've done too much intensity work in low energy, or you've done so much of one and nothing of something else. And we can work with that within a training week. Let's dive into that and talk about what does go into a good cardio program. And we can talk about frequency and intensities, and maybe we can also describe the different zones, because that has also confused so many women.
Yeah, don't do cardio, ladies. You'll immediately blow up and die. So yeah, I think that the first thing to state when it comes to cardio is start where you are at and ease in with where you're at. I think so many of the messaging for women of saying, like, to your point of doing sprint or HIIT training is like, I get women in my DMs being like, I did that and I just exploded. I went to 3 days of HIIT after doing no cardio at all. And I'm like, no, you need to titrate and ease yourself in. But they're so afraid to do zone 2 or zone 3 training now, because those both have been deemed problematic, that they're just jumping to high intensities. But if you have very little background in cardiovascular training, maybe you've only been walking or only been doing low intensity activity or only resistance training and not really doing any formal cardio at all, you should ease in with probably easy to moderate intensity activity where it's comfortable and build build your tolerance from there. That doesn't mean you can't jump into higher intensity stuff, but for a lot of people, that it's not as tolerable, it's not as comfortable, or they feel like it's really hard, and therefore it's not as motivating or engaging right off the bat. Now, if you like, that's totally fine. But start where you're at, start with where your fitness is at, and ease in. And it's okay to start with like higher intensity stuff, because I don't think people realize that the less you do, the less how much intense versus easy you do matters. If you're below or just at the exercise guidelines, which is 150 minutes of moderate intensity per week or 75 minutes of like vigorous to hard activity, really what you do with your time, whether that's high, hard, medium, low, doesn't matter. The fact that you're getting it in matters the most. And whatever way meets your fitness where it's at, you're comfortable with, you feel good with, you're willing to stick to, great. Where it starts to need to be a little bit more nuanced, the word that no one likes in the female fitness space, is that as you do more, the intensity of what you do it at is going to start to matter more. Because the more you do, the less you can handle doing all of it at higher intensity. So right now I'm training for a marathon, and I'm running about 7.5 hours a week and biking 2 hours a week on top of it. That's 9.5 hours a week of cardiovascular training. If I did that all in zone 4 to 5, I would never recover. I'd feel horrific. I would blow up. It would be really hard to do and sustain and adhere to that. And or all of my training would just start to look moderate, because I wouldn't be able to actually work at those higher end of my power outputs or speed outputs or whatever that looks like, because of how much intensity that I'm doing. So therefore, I need to do a lot of that moderate to easy in order to make those hard days and those hard training sessions that I am truly and actually hard. But this winter, I pulled back my volume of running and training. I was training for high rocks races, and I was focusing on getting faster. So a greater percent of my overall training was higher and hard intensity, but I was doing less. I think I was maybe doing 5 hours of cardiovascular training in a week at that time. So a greater percent of that was high intensity, and I was able to handle it, recover, and adapt to it. And so people think it has to be this perfect split of easy versus hard, or zone X versus zone Y, but really, like, the more you do, the more of it's going to have to be easy, because you're not going to be able to handle and recover that. A lot of elite endurance athletes do a ton of zone 2 work because of that. But if you're not doing a lot, which most people aren't doing moderate to high volumes of endurance activity, you don't need to obsess over the minutia of what you're actually spinning your zones in, unless you have specific goals. And so all that to say, I really like this approach to cardiovascular training that's either polarized or pyramidal. Both work. Everyone wants to talk about if one's better than the other. It probably depends on the person. But the idea is that you're distributing your time across low, moderate, and hard intensity exercise. You're not just kind of doing all of the same thing, unless you're not doing a lot at all. Then it doesn't matter. I'm going to keep going back to that point for people, because I really want to nail that and drill that home. But when we talk about that, that means that when you think about the 5-zone model, which is traditionally what people are referring to in the online space, you have zone 1, which is like pretty low intensity exercise, probably walking or light cardio for a lot of people, into zone 2, which a lot of people more classically think as easy exercise. And so this is roughly 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. That really varies by person and their fitness status and level, but that's the rough of what a lot of people refer to. Then we have zone 3, which is like moderate intensity. So it's still very aerobic in nature, but it's slightly more stressful on the body. We start to have increases in lactate, increases in respiration. So it can be a little bit harder to recover from than zone 2 itself, which is why people usually favor zone 2 to this, but it's not inherently bad. Again, I'm training for a marathon right now. All of my faster stuff right now is in zone 3, justice for zone 3, right? Because you need to do it for that type of goal. But the problem is a lot of people will end up having all of their cardio training not being super easy in zone 2, but they're not pushing all the way into zone 4 or 5. So they fall into this bucket of like everything's moderate all the time. Again, if you're not doing a lot, it doesn't matter. That's great that you're doing anything. But a lot of the messages against zone 3 training, or even zone 2 with women, is that when you get to zone 4 and 5, which are your more high hard intensity. So these are going to be things like steady state, higher hard effort work, thresholds, tempos, high intensity interval training intervals that are longer to shorter sprint interval training. That's going to span a spectrum of like hard to very hard intensity exercise. And like we mentioned before, you can't do all of your training there all of the time unless you're doing very little, because you can't keep up that effort, or you're not going to recover. You're going to feel terrible, or it's not going to be as high of quality, and it's going to shift down to that zone 3. And so a lot of the messages target towards women are capitalizing on this fact that a lot of women who are doing quote unquote high intensity interval training, that's just group fitness boot camp class 6 days a week, are just kind of doing moderate intensity lifting with some cardio mixed in that kind of falls in that zone 3E effort, even though it feels harder to them in their perception. So they're never really doing that thing where you're polarizing it or pyramidizing it, where you're essentially distributing your time in easy, moderate and hard, or easy and hard intensity. So you just want a little bit more variety in your training. So I usually tell people, once you get past like 2 to 3 hours a week of cardio, start to think about spreading it out a little bit more between these different intensities and efforts. So that way you have maybe 1 or 2 days per week that really are specifically hard. Maybe that's high intensity interval training. Maybe that's sprint interval training. Maybe that's your high rocks prep workout or your Metcon, your CrossFit class, your boot camp class, whatever that looks like. Cause women like their group fitness. I'm not gonna tell them to stop doing that. But then maybe the rest of your week, so that you can go your hardest and get the most out of those sessions, is more of that, zone 2, quote unquote, effort, so that it's easier and recoverable, or you can do it and still balance your strength training and the rest of the things that you're doing in your life. So it's just about teasing that out. I think so many people like to paint this picture that like fitness hasn't considered women. No, the fitness industry has marketed to you this do max effort, max capacity, undereat, be skinny, do cardio for calorie burn and fat loss message. Exercise and sports science has never promoted that. It's always been cardio programs that are balanced in a variety of intensities. And then that balance of those intensities just depends on how much you're doing, how often you're doing it, and what your goals are with it. And then obviously your fitness status going into it. My beginner runners coming to me, I'm not giving them any high intensity stuff because they can barely even tolerate the running to begin with. But as they gain more frequency or time across the week of running, how much volume they're doing, then we can start to add in those layers of intensity or more volume or more frequency as they go. But your programs have to meet you and your fitness level where they're at. They also have to consider how much you're doing. And if you're starting to do more, think about just balancing it across that spectrum a little bit more. I think a lot of women just get stuck in one gear and one mode all of the time, and they've never followed a program that balances or polarizes. Some days you do hard stuff. Some days you do moderate stuff. Some days you do easy stuff. Like your week ebb and flows. You can recover and adapt and adjust, both lifting and endurance or cardio training. They just have one gear, one max, one mode, or they do nothing. And that's where most fitness geared advice goes wrong to women. And most of these messages capitalize on that being women's experience, being the cardio bunny chirping away or milling away on the treadmill just to burn X amount of calories on their watch, rather than I'm specifically going to be intentional about what this cardio session is for. We've never made cardio intentional like we do lifting or any sort of resistance training or anything like that. But the same components that go into a good lifting program also go into into a good cardio program as well.
There's a lot of really usable advice there. So let me do my best to try and summarize that. If you're new to the fitness space and you've really not been doing much, let's just focus on getting you going, not worrying too much about your intensity zones, but starting easier rather than harder. And then look about your maximum, if I were to use a phrase, your maximum recoverable training volume. So when you're doing hard sessions, make sure that they're hard. And then on the other sessions, make sure they're easy enough so that you can recover from them and train hard again, which when you look across the week and you've got weights and you've got intervals and you've got other lifetime stress, this is where the lower intensity steady state comes in, because you're still getting benefit, but you're not pulling those high intensity levers.
Yeah.
What would you say to women who really only have 30 minutes here and there to train because they are so time crunched? Would you recommend that the endurance sessions, cardio sessions, are high intensity based? Or how do you go about making sure you're not overtrained and under recovered if you are always redlining the car?
Yeah. So I think that obviously that goes back to the less you do, the less it matters. But a lot of women are also really stressed, and they're stressed all of the time. And then they layer that onto stress in their training. And that's where I think that a lot of women have negative experience with high intensity training. They're like, well, I feel better when I brought it back to easier stuff. And here's the thing. Easy stuff works. It's not that it doesn't work. High intensity can get you more bang for your buck in less time, but that doesn't mean that everything you do has to be high intensity. And so what I usually suggest is, because I think a lot of advice that I see people saying to me is they think they have to do 2 or 3 high intensity sessions a week for it to count or for it to matter. You can start with one. And if you only do one, a week and you can recover that and you're balancing that with your strength work and your other cardio and everything else in your life. And here's the thing. When it comes to fitness, if you are making progress, you're getting fitter in those individual sessions or you're getting better, keep doing it. Just because you think that I think women fall into the trap of thinking I need to do more or the most or the best, the perfect. But say you're doing your classic 4x4 high intensity interval training session. That's just a very classic model. I used 4 rounds of 4 minutes with 3 minutes of rest in between, slightly Norwegian, but not totally in my dissertation. So say you're just doing that classic. You're doing 4 rounds of 4 minutes of high intensity intervals, resting for 3 to 4 minutes between. If every week that you do that, you start to do it a little bit at a higher output, you're able to push harder, cover more distance, burn more calories on the ergs. By that, I don't mean like calories that your body's burning, but it's just a metric on like your Concept 2 bikes or rowers or ski ergs or whatever that looks like, or go further or whatever, if you see some sort of physiological adaptation, even it feeling easier or your heart rate being able to it can go either way. You can go lower because it's less stressful, or it can go higher because you're able to push harder kind of thing. If you can improve those metrics, guess what? It's working. And you could just keep doing that every single week and keep making progress. Like if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of thing. And I even only do like one really hard intensity session per week within my training. And I did a lot of the same thing over and over, the same running things this year. And I kept getting fitter and better. And again, if it's not broke, don't fix it. If it's driving adaptation for fitness, you're recovering, you feel good, you can handle it with your life stress and everything you've going on. One of those 30-minute sessions per week, do it high and harder intense, and then do the other ones easy. And if you feel like you can handle more, or you're adapting well, or, you've adapted to that first training session, maybe the next day is like a sprint interval session. So you're doing 20 to 30 seconds, really hard, all out type session for that 30 minutes. And maybe then you're just keeping that third day easy. I don't know where women have gotten this, like I have to do 3 days a week of HIIT for it to count thing. I don't know where that came from in the industry, but I'm asked about it all the time. And you do not need to do 3 days a week of HIIT for your cardio to count. Even if you're short on time, that third day could be in zone 3. And if you're only doing 90 minutes of cardio a week, that's totally fine. I'd rather you honestly do it in zone 3 and get a little bit more of an aerobic benefit than worry about it being perfect, or make it a hike,
Right.
make it playing with your kids, make it running your dog, like whatever that looks like for you, make it something enjoyable. Don't forget to factor that in with the time that you have each week. But yeah, the less you do, the more intense it can be. But you don't need to make those 3 30-minute sessions you have all be the highest, hardest effort it can be. And also, so many people tell you that you can't do the group fitness class or the high rocks workout or the Metcon is bad. You could do that for those 3 workouts. And if you mix in enough like of a erg or cardio component to it, you're probably going to get enough of a cardio stimulus. And if you're doing less, but that makes it fun and you're willing to do it, totally fine. The issue is only when you start doing more and more and more of it, then those 3 Metcons per week might need to be balanced with just 2 Metcons per week and 3 easier sessions, or the group fitness class, you're only doing it 1 or 2 times a week and the rest is easier. It's just, you can't keep building and building and tipping that scale. So short answer, 3 days a week, 30 minutes. Start with 1 being high intensity sprint interval training. Make it a Metcon or something fun that you like to do first. Then as you adapt and build, you can add in that second day and see if you tolerate it. And one thing to consider too is don't just think about volume it across the week. Think about it in the session. You can start with 2 rounds of 4-minute intervals of HIIT and start there, and then build to 3, and then build to the 4. Or the sprint interval training, you can start with just 4 20-second intervals and build to 6 over time. Like it doesn't have to be these like highest, most max volume protocols out there. You can pull it back. You can do less rounds or less reps of something to where it's comfortable for you to be and build from there. So yeah, that would be my solution for 30 minutes. And I know that gives people a lot of like agency in deciding what they want to do. And I know a lot of people want to be told absolutely what to do, but I'm really big in autonomy in fitness. And if you're not having specific cardio goals, that's where I think you can actually have a lot of variety and fun in your program. And I know a lot of women don't like resistance training to begin with because it's not variable and fun, and they like the variability and fun. Make your cardio something variable and fun that you genuinely like to do. And you're not missing out on like muscle power and strength benefits that you might get from high intensity interval or sprint training if you are also resistance training. Like you're still getting a lot of that there. So like you can make your cardio fun. It can change weekly. You can do what you like to do within reason, of course, of keeping in mind that like we don't want to just burn the candle at both ends all the time.
Right. And just to take a small step back, I think the 3 times of HIIT a week have come from scientific studies that have looked at something for 4 to 6 weeks and compared sprint training to endurance training and said, look how much better they improved at 1/8 of the time commitments. And we all know that in coaching, if you rev the system for 4 weeks, that's called peaking. And
Yes.
that's what athletes do before competitions. But that's not a recipe for long-term practice. And every coach knows this, but the
Yes.
public is convinced by an influencer who says, well, you compare these two, this is so much better 3 times a week.
Yeah. And they do a lot. This is one too. This is a red flag that I really wish people knew more about. If anyone is telling you that something is increased by like a percent, I usually use that as a red flag because I've seen so many influencers quote that one study that came from a blog of saying sprint interval training burns like, I don't know, like 40% more fat than moderate intensity. But when you look at the absolute difference between them or the fold change, it was like 1.1 versus 1.2 or something like that. And so I've seen a lot of that in the influencer space. That makes sense. Yeah. I was like, what podcast are they listening to that they think if they don't do the HIIT 3 days a week, that they're failing their fitness goals? And if you can tolerate it, great, but it might not be totally necessary. And I think a lot of people don't realize in those studies is that long term, the easier stuff does eventually catch up in a lot of the adaptations that we see in mitochondrial stuff or aerobic VO2, all that stuff. It just lags. And the unfortunate part is easy stuff does take volume. So you can kind of cheat that to some degree with intensity with training. But again, there's a tipping point of that. Eventually, if you want more, you're going to have to do more. But that's a decision you need to make for the goals that you have. But the easy stuff does work. It just sometimes takes, it's like a slower train coming in your body with that signal, but eventually it does catch up or overlap the same adaptations as drinking from the fire hose approach that we see in a lot of that.
And this often said phrase that success leaves clues. If you look at how successful endurance athletes who've had success over many years, how they've trained, it's not as hard as they can go 3 times a week and very little else. And I think we should be looking at the history of endurance athletes and who's been successful and how do they do it. And we've got a lot of information there. Let's turn our attention to the downsides of HIIT, because there is certain circles of the internet that will scare females off doing high intensity work because of cortisol. Could you just briefly address that? And then we'll turn our attention to the other end of the spectrum, which is low intensity.
Yes. So there's this huge narrative that intensity is bad for women across the board, which is so funny because there's the other half of the internet saying intensity is the only thing that you should do, right? I feel bad for women. But there's this idea that it's this cortisol spiking. I call it the cortisol boogeyman. But again, this is where there's this lack of depth of understanding that people aren't giving you, is that cortisol is a normal, acute. So many influencers confuse or conflate acute with chronic responses. They do it with cortisol and they do it with inflammation. And then they sell you a scary thing because of that. So there's a normal, natural acute, which means short-term response of cortisol to training. This endocrine response in response to training is essential. It's necessary. It's important, because if not, when I go out and start my run, my blood sugar would just completely plummet and I'd probably pass out on my run because my body's not saying, hey, we need to release glucose into the bloodstream. We need to start releasing triglycerides. We need to just start. It's a signal to your body that there's a stressor that you need to support. Stressors aren't bad. Exercise is a stressor. That stress from that causes this endocrine response is in part entirely is what results in the positive adaptations we get from exercise. You need that acute stress from exercise in order to both supply your body with the nutritional needs that it needs internally to fuel and sustain or just activate all of your systems for exercise. But it's acute, which means that following exercise training, it will come down. Now, there is truth that there is a quote unquote heightened cortisol response to high intensity training. The irony here is most of these studies are done in like college age males. Honestly, like a lot of people like there's not really totally done in female populations, but like the point is that they're acute and or they're typically going to be less the more trained you are. So the first time you do a high intensity session, you're going to have a greater stress response or whatever you want to call it, cortisol response to that training. But as your body gets used to that over time, it will lessen or it will be blunted. And or the biggest thing that I tell women all of the time is if you are so worried about your cortisol and stress response, eat enough food. Like when we see even with the moderate to continuous steady state studies, if your blood sugar stays stable, that cortisol response doesn't start to drift upward because it's less stressful on your body to be adequately fed to support the training that you're doing. So if you are super, super, super worried about exercise being too stressful for you, just make sure you're eating enough across the day to support the activity that you're doing, or you're not like going into training with like completely depleted glycogen stores and a body that doesn't have anything to fuel it, right? And so there is this acute cortisol response, but again, it's adaptable, it's short-term, it's necessary, and or it is part of the normal exercise response and process. You're not going to ever stop it, and you don't want to stop it. That's part of what you want to happen with training. But there's this idea that that is the thing that is causing hormonal imbalances or making you gain weight, or it's destroying your hormones. And again, if we go back to programming cardio appropriately, or with women, I always say making sure that you're just eating enough to support your activity levels, those things are corrected for by a balanced program that has you doing enough intensity versus recoverable, easy stuff. Or again, you're eating to support and recover for your goals. I always tell, especially premenopausal women in low energy availability or have amenorrhea or loss of menstrual cycle have higher inflammatory and higher cortisol markers than women who are just having a normal natural menstrual cycle and are well fed in our training. And these are things that have been seen in athletic populations, so more trained individuals. The scarier thing, the thing they should be worried about more than anything is under eating, right? Which again, people, when I talk about that, they're always like, so you're against fat loss or weight loss? No, eating enough and appropriately isn't overeating. It's also just not saying you can never go into energy deficit. It's just about not doing these crazy, extreme, yo-yo-y diet things that women do. So usually I say, shift your fear of cortisol to not eating to support your goals and your performance or whatever that looks like appropriately kind of thing, or extreme crash dieting things. That is way scarier when we think about it from like your health or your hormones than the cortisol boogeyman of HIIT. You're going to have a better adaptation to your metabolism or your metabolic capacity from doing that HIIT as long as it's programmed appropriately than negative implication at all from that normal adaptive stress response.
That's great. And what about then the moderate intensity steady state with zone 2? Because you're right, women are bombarded with two completely conflicting sources of advice. Avoid HIIT, avoid zone 2, and then it's the opposite. So where does the fear mongering come about moderate intensity steady state?
Yeah, I think it comes from that idea that women are doing so much of that, like they think is hard type cardio that isn't hard, that all falls moderate. Because if everything you do is hard, none of it's hard. That's where that comes from.
Right.
And that goes back to our conversation earlier of like, just balance out hard and easy. There, done, check. Don't worry about it. And then sometimes moderate is good. Moderate is necessary. It's part of training. It's not always a bad thing. It's only bad if you're doing a lot of it all of the time. That's all that you're doing. But again, if you're only doing like the exercise guidelines and you're in zone 3 for 150 minutes per week, guess what? You're doing pretty good. It's when you start to do more and more that you just want to distribute that. So that's where that first one comes from, is just the approach a lot of women take to training and not balancing out high and hard intensity per week. But there's this also baseline like physiology, sex difference that women have potentially more type 1 muscle fibers or better fat burners or better, fat oxidizers is actually the more scientifically correct term here. And so a lot of people take that and run with that. So they say, well, women are naturally more endurance favored, so therefore they don't need to train that at all. And honestly, my dissertation data actually doesn't support this. And I know my studies aren't the only studies out there. Women who aren't, just because women have this baseline like sex difference favoring of type 1 muscle fibers or fat oxidation, does not mean that a sedentary woman right off the bat is amazing aerobically. You still need the training stress and the training adaptation in order to maximize and improve that. So women, when trained, become better fat oxidizers or improve and they get better aerobic fitness, which is a reflection of all those underlying systems that improve in response to cardio training. And in my dissertation studies, I did high versus low intensity in my groups in exercise metabolism response and then postprandial metabolism. And the low fit women were significantly poorer fat burners than the higher fit women in my studies because it's still a training adaptation. So I think there's this idea that, well, women are naturally better at it, so they don't need to do it. No, that isn't true. You still, even if you have the baseline equipment to the genetics for a sport or whatever, you're not going to magically make it for Division I football just because you just happen to have the genetics for it. You still need the stimulus and stress to maximize those adaptations. So I think a lot of that comes from this idea that, well, we're naturally better at it, so we don't need it. I think the better response that I try so hard to correct for is that women should just have some intensity in their training. It's not that they shouldn't do easy stuff. It's that there's probably a benefit potentially to having some more intensity in their training if we really want to like get nitty-gritty into that. Like there's enough data that says that like people adapt to high intensity interval or sprint interval training. It can improve power output and or some of those type 2 muscle fibers. So let's train that. That should be part of your training. But the message shouldn't be avoid zone 2. It should be, if you're going to do zone 2, also include a little bit of intensity in your training too. Again, going back to that polarizing. And so that's where I think that message comes from. But a lot of that message too is also very molecular in nature, or, looking at muscle fiber stuff. And we do have these sex differences. But again, women adapt to endurance training. We have women elite runners. Like if this didn't work for them, it wouldn't work at all, right? Like I know antidote doesn't always pan out, but I always just like to point back to female athletes when people make these narratives. I'm like, look at like what they're doing. They do the high volumes of easy stuff in order to do that. It's not like their physiology is like, nope, we have to do HIIT for every single workout for the rest of our lives or we won't adapt. So that's where this narrative comes from, is that men are more glycolytic and we're more fat oxidative. So we should train opposite, so to speak. And there's some loose data that like men might need more of this overall volume to match the adaptations that women get. And again, some that's like very early on. It's not like very conclusive. It's just like maybe we might need less exercise guidelines to get the same benefits in premenopause. That's great, but like it's not robust enough for me to say women should just stop doing easy cardio, right? If anything, women, there's just not my dissertation study. There's been a few other ones that looked at fitness status versus fat oxidative capacity and all these things. And the higher fit women across the board are burning more fat. So it's not just your sex that's going to make you super metabolically efficient off the bat. Exercise training is still a necessary stressor and response, specifically cardiovascular training, to maximize that. And so a lot of people think of that as like being a fat burner for like fat loss. Fat burner is just your ability to oxidize or use fat for fuel during exercise or across your day or in response to what you eat, and being more metabolically quote unquote efficient. You're just good at switching between carbs and fat and what your body needs and storing and burning. But that is directly associated with aerobic fitness status and or weight status in a lot of these studies. And so I think it's very negligent for us to stop to tell people to avoid something that we know contributes to that positive adaptation that we need for those metabolic adaptations. Too long, didn't read. Do both.
And I think that's a really important point, because there's no coach who would ever prescribe your exercise program based on how much fat you burn in a training session. How are you ever going to know?
You're
But it
not.
seems to ignore all the studies that actually compare men and women at different intensities and look at training outcomes. So why are we giving training advice based on what you burn at a certain intensity in the fasted state, which is what all these studies are doing, versus when we've got studies that have actually looked at the outcome of interest? And I think that's all part of the confusion.
And honestly, I have run so many metabolic tests. The amount of fat you're literally burning in a HIIT session it's so minimal. But the more fit you are, the more you are burning fat. Like that's all I did for years, was analyze that data. Yes, we have some studies that show in steady state submaximal, so like zone 2-3 activity, women do oxidize a higher percentage of fat than males in those lower intensities, but lower fit women are going to still oxidize less fat than those women, right? Like there's still a fitness status component to it. And there's a part of my dissertation that I love. It says like, thinking about like the metabolism and exercise and women in the menstrual cycle or birth control, I think I put nutrition status matters more. And that's what my second study found. Nutrition status, fed status matters more than fitness status and being fed and or the intensity of exercise all override any differences we see with the menstrual cycle or birth control. So if you just feed women before exercise trials, most of those differences go away, and or your performance differences actually might just go away. I know fasted versus fed is really controversial, but like if you eat because in a phase of your cycle or life where you feel crummy and you're going to perform poor, if you eat carbs during or before that, you're probably going to perform better, and it's going to probably make up for some of that, what you're feeling. Or two, being fitter is going to override any other difference of your menstrual cycle or your birth control or whatever that looks like there. And even those like cute little things there, like once you get to high enough intensity, the differences between sex or the differences even between like fitness tests, like they go away. Because once you exercise intense enough, it doesn't matter. You just start burning carbs across the board. And so, yeah, no one's programming things off that. I think a lot of people, instead of freaking out or focusing on being like a fat burner or even more metabolically flexible, which I spent my years of my life researching, or any of these things, like I tell people, focus on improving a metric of your cardiovascular endurance, whether that's running a faster mile or a faster 5K or covering more distance in a time trial or just being able to do more total work in whatever it is that you're doing. It doesn't have to be running. I always use running as an example just because I'm a running, but like maybe you're doing a 30-minute bike session and you cover more distance, or you can do it at a higher heart intensity. That's an adaptation fitness status. Don't worry about your VO2 max. Don't worry about being a fat burner. Don't worry about these things that you can't measure and test. And I've measured and tested them for years and it doesn't matter. I'm not measuring and test them in my own fitness. But if I go out for a run and I'm running 30 seconds per mile faster than I was a year ago, guess what? All of those things that we're worried about improving, improved. I have a higher VO2 max. I probably improved my mitochondrial capacity in some regard. I'm better at clearing lactate. I'm more metabolically flexible, whatever you want to call it, right? Those improve, but I don't need to go to a lab to test that. I can just tell because I'm able to accomplish more work in a single session. Just like I talked about earlier with like, you can do the same thing week after week, but if you're improving, it's working. That's great. I think more people just focus on improving some sort of metric. And maybe that's just being able to do 30 minutes of cardio and building up to being able to tolerate that. But you'll be more fit when you're able to handle doing 30 minutes of cardio than freaking out if you can't get a lab test for fat oxidation or whatever it is.
That's great. Let's look at the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to resistance training for women. What goes into a good program?
Yeah. So unfortunately, probably all the same things that go into a program for men. I know people hate that, but really when I think about women's training, I call this my like little triad of training, and it's really my training triad for everyone, but I like to think of it for women of like, what do you need to think about in your training? And so I want cardiovascular training, right? Distributing between moderate, hard, high intensity, whatever that looks like for you, resistance training, and then just like some sort of like combination or whatever it looks like of anything, power, jumping, plyometrics, anything like explosive, just a little bit of something, a little that's doing that. And so I like to categorize like power, plyometrics, jumping, and strength training kind of all together, because all those things can kind of be put into a program that can support that. And I like this because one, I really like to train everyone a little bit like an athlete, because I think that that helps with maintaining our robustness as we age, but it's all should be scaled to where you're at. And I think that's where a lot of confusion comes from good lifting programs for women, is that they're like, oh, I'm so intimidated by this. Well, one, let's start where you're at and scale it to where you look. Like that's a good program, a good lifting program. When you do it, the first day that you do it should not feel impossible, overwhelming, defeating, like you never want to show up again. It should feel, okay, like this is realistic. I can do this. It challenged me, but it's not exhausting me. I think that's where a lot of women, they want their lifting program to exhaust them like cardio or boot camp classes. And lifting is going to be hard, and it should feel hard, but it should feel hard in a different way. It shouldn't feel exhausting in that same way of doing a high intensity interval workout or a boot camp class or a cardio session. And so we want to think about something that challenges you, but also targets your body specifically for gaining strength or muscle across the board, or some sort of power preservation as we age. And so I can be more specific. I'm talking very general here, and I apologize for that. So when I think about it, a good resistance training program is going to have just a generalized warm-up. You're not going to spend 45 minutes in the gym full foam rolling and flopping on the floor or doing this huge prep routine. I like this phrase, get in, get warm, and get moving. As you get older, you might feel like you need a little bit more time to, grease the gears and get into that. Totally fine. That's not saying not to warm up. Do what you need to do, but you don't need this fancy 30-minute session. I think there's this narrative specifically in menopause where, because recovery might be poorer, tendon and ligament problems might rise up, that you need to spend like their whole session just doing mobility and prep work. Do enough to support yourself as you need, but then use that time to maximize the benefits of the time you have, because most of us are crunched on time, and spend it doing things that are specifically targeted at strength or hypertrophy. And so you don't have to lift with a barbell. Machines are perfectly fine. Heavy dumbbells, kettlebells are fine. And heavy is relative to you. And so when we say heavy, we want to think about working at an effort of like a 7 to 9 out of 10 is where I like to tell people target that. If you're a beginner, you can start with like a 6 to 7, 6 to 8 range and ease into that with where you're at. So that way you feel like when you're doing your sessions, like if you were to ask yourself, okay, out of 10, what was that effort? That it should fall in that range. And an easy flip side to that is reps in reserve of saying, I could only do 1, 2, 3, or 4 reps left. Most women, if you're listening to this, you probably think that you're working at a 7 to 9 out of 10 effort, but you are so many reps shy of failure than what you're actually doing. And I think that's where a lot of women get frustrated that lifting isn't working for them, because the quality, quote unquote, of their sets, of the valuable time they're spending in the gym trying to get stronger is underloading them. So they're so far away from the stress and adaptation. Now, any lifting is good. This is not saying do what you need to start where you're at, but whether you're using bands in your house or dumbbells or, heavy weights in the gym, take yourself to truly like 70 to 80 to 90% of the max effort that you can give in that. And a great way to test this is like a lot of women, I think if you didn't play sports or you're new to lifting and you're later in life, maybe you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s or beyond, and you've never really lifted, is give yourself something to anchor to. You might not know what failure feels like. A lot of athletes, they know what failure feels like. They know how close it is. So take something that feels safe or is like isolating. So maybe just like a bicep curl, right? Like something that's not like as scary as a squat, and take it all the way to failure and see how many more reps you do, and give that to yourself as an idea of like, okay, that's what failure truly feels like. And so when you're lifting heavy and hard enough in these lifting sets, you want to have your last few reps slow down. They should start to get slower. How fast you're doing them will slow down. And that's how you know you're probably getting closer to where you should be in these things. So I really harp on effort because I think that's going to get the most out of what you're doing in the gym. I think a lot of women will opt for a ton of reps and sets and exercises. They'll do like 10 exercises for 4x10 for everything. And they'll do a bunch of stuff on these workouts and these gyms or these apps or classes that they're doing. But you can actually do less, but just do it harder or higher quality, and you're going to get more kind of bang for buck out of your session. And so after you have your warm up, you can move into your like main compound exercises. Now, again, barbell, machine, whatever that looks like, but these are going to be your multi-joint or multi-muscle movements. So your squat patterns, your deadlift or your RDL or your hinging patterns, you're pressing from the chest, pressing overhead, rowing and pulling into your body, things that are using a lot of muscle at once when you're doing them. You kind of want to do those first and really get the most bang for your buck there. And if you're going to do anything at all, just do those. You can just do those and get so much benefit from that, especially if you can load it heavy or hard enough or intense enough within your training. Then from there, you can do your accessory stuff. So maybe you're doing single leg things like a step up or a lunge or a single leg RDL or, a single leg hip thrust, or just, it can still be double movement, whatever that looks like to you, double leg, double arms. Maybe you're isolating something out. Maybe you want to grow some delts and some boulder shoulder. So you want to do some lateral raises or some rear flies. That's when you can start to get like more granular in your isolation or, less major muscle body parts. You kind of work downward in your training program from warm up to big muscles, lots of muscles, heavier lifts to that isolation. But you really only need a few exercises in a training session to get a lot of quality. You don't need 10 exercises in your day. You can have 1 or 2 main movements and then maybe 1, 2, or 3 other of these accessory movements, some core in there, and get a really good training program. And working between like 2 to 3 sets, maybe 4 to 5 sets if you're doing more weight and less reps for more strength stuff, taking to that quality, and you can kind of get in the gym and get what you need out of your sessions. There isn't a specific rep range that you can work out as a woman. You can do anywhere from 1 reps to 30 reps as long as that quality is there and still get all of the benefits of your training. So if you like lighter loads but higher reps and you can take it to that closeness to failure, great. You can do that. Stick with it. That's totally fine. If you love heavy, strong lifting and you want to do that, amazing. Great. Do that. All of it can work. I recommend kind of cycling through, working across that spectrum over time. You don't have to go 1, 2, or 3 reps like heavy powerlifters, but 5 to 15 is a great range to like kind of oscillate between as you go in your training program across the year. Again, it can go outside of that, but I think that's like just a good operating range that for people like hard concrete numbers kind of thing. If you're at home, you're using bands, dumbbells, lighter weights, but you need to go to that 15, 20, 25, 30 range if you need to get close to that, or find ways to make it harder, like slowing down the tempo or isolations and things like that. And then if you're comfortable and or feel capable or want to, you can add in things like plyometrics, jumping or power-based movements before those heavy compounds. So you'll do your warm-up, do your more explosive type stuff, and then go into your strength workouts. But that is like something where I'm like, that's great to have in your program, but that isn't as needed as the lifting stuff kind of thing. But I like the idea of everyone doing a little bit of that. It supports bone, it supports muscle, it supports power. It works great in conjunction with the lifting for a lot of those. But again, you don't need to start with it. I know that's really intimidating for a lot of people. That doesn't have to be the first thing. The lifting that you're doing is most important. But I think when we tell women to do all these things, they're like, where am I going to fit this in? I like to just plug that in there, that can fit in as part of your like strength gym work. It doesn't need to be its own day or another workout that you do on top of it. It can be part of that training that you're doing. And that's the way that I like to approach it. I really think full body 2 or 3 days a week is great for most people who aren't very specific. Honestly, I train mostly full body or full body with maybe an upper day or whatever that looks like 2 or 3 days a week myself. And I get so much bang for my buck with it because it's really great for people who want to be efficient on time. But if you prefer a bodybuilding bro split and you have the time and you want to do it, those can work. I don't think those work for most people because most people don't want to spend 6 days a week isolating their back and biceps. Most women don't. But you can totally do that. Or you can favor, a lot of people poo-poo on women wanting to favor legs and booty gains. And I'm like, great, load your hips, load your spine, load your lower body. That's amazing. I'm happy if you want to do an extra glute and lower body day because that's the gains that you want. Just don't neglect the rest of your body in the pursuit of those things. And just make sure that you're touching all your major muscle groups at least once or twice a week in your training. So hopefully that gives a clear enough idea for women of like what that looks like. And of course, like you can make it work for you, your equipment, your fitness level, and your situation. A lot of programs are going to look the same. Just how you program the frequency or the intensity or the complexity of the movement you're doing can vary by preference or fitness and skill level.
Mm-hmm. And that's this concept of periodization, that you can mix these things up and progress to some of the more explosive plyometric movements in time. The menopause transition and the change in estrogen has been used as an argument, and this phrase, the best. And if you're approaching menopause or passing through it, the best exercise is now heavy lifting, 4 sets of 4, 5 sets of 5, and power training to do what estrogen was doing. And I find that a little confusing because when I either look at books behind me, I've got every major book dating back to the 1800s on resistance training, or you read the science, and a whole host of rep ranges have been used. And the argument is, yes, but that's all done in men. And women, because of estrogen, require something different. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have the data to say that magically moderate to high reps suddenly stop working. I think the idea is that, again, these messages lack the nuance of what they're really trying to say. Most women neglected adequately loaded resistance training most of their life. And so for them, lifting heavy is something that might be beneficial for them to do as they're aging or going through menopause because they were never lifting at all, or they were doing, again, the kind of underloaded boot campy type classes. So the message of load your stuff heavier is correct, but then it gets skewed into everyone needs to be doing essentially powerlifting style training or you don't get benefits for bone or muscle or aging or estrogen loss or any of that stuff. Again, it lacks the nuance of what it's actually trying to say. And then women feel really confused because they're like, what does this mean for me? But we could use more trials on some of the lower weight, higher rep stuff. But as of now, we don't have anything that says that women don't adapt to low, moderate, and high, or bone is even not responding to it. Yes, we have these trials that show heavy lifting does work, right? Just like we have trials that show HIIT and sprint training does work. But that doesn't mean the other things don't work too. And I think that's the message that gets lost in a lot of this. And I really think it does a disservice because so many women are intimidated by 4x4 back squats or 5x5 deadlifts, right? Especially if they've never lifted in their life. But that doesn't mean that the other stuff they're doing is worthless. They're not getting benefit from it. Or even if they're intimidated by heavier loads, that's where some of that power and stuff, like you could do fast trap bar deadlifts that adds an element of explosiveness to it, but it's lighter loaded and still like be positive and beneficial for you in your training. There's these good coaches and trainers know how to manipulate these variables so you can get enough of a stress or stimulus to add up to what you're trying to do. But yeah, I haven't seen the data. The only data that I've seen out there was those few review studies that came out that show that menopausal women might benefit from slightly higher volume in their training, but it was like 6 versus 8 total sets of body parts per
Exactly.
week. So that's just volume, but we know volume is an important component. So maybe if there's less sensitivity to resistance training, and those studies weren't compared to premenopausal or men or anything like that, it just showed that they had a more significant response in these trials with 8 versus 6 sets of these exercises. So that is maybe just doing more, but you can increase volume easier with lower loads and higher reps, honestly. So yeah, it's lacking a lot of the nuance. So for the women listening, again, do whatever resistance training that you are willing to do. Whatever you are willing to do that. But don't feel like you only have to do 5x5 or 4x4. One, no, there's nothing that says that's the only thing that works. And two, you will get more benefit from just taking it heavy relative to what you are doing, whether that's the rep range or the exercise or your fitness level, regardless of where you fall, as long as you're kind of keeping it under 30 reps. What we see is if you get to 30 to 60% of your 1 rep max and you take that close to failure, I know the data is kind of murky on where that actually falls, but just take it heavy and hard enough, regardless of what you're doing. The issue is a lot of people, it's really hard to take high rep ranges that close to failure. It kind of just gets fatiguing and boring. But if you can and you're willing to do it, great, do it, go for it. But yeah, you can make a lot of gains if you never touch a rep under 10 and you're lifting and you feel comfortable with that. And I just know a lot of people feel safer in those moderate to high rep ranges. And that's totally fine if you're willing to do it. But yeah, I don't think there's anything that says that suddenly you stop responding to any of these training protocols, especially man, if you got to menopause or perimenopause and you never resistance trained before in your life, you can look at a weight and you're going to probably have a positive training adaptation response to it to start. So just start.
Right. And let's not forget, we actually have thousands of resistance training studies in postmenopausal women looking at muscle, strength, and bone.
Yeah.
And that is all very positive that you can grow muscle and get stronger at any age.
Yeah.
With most rep ranges, but most studies are using between 8 and 12 repetitions, which is the moderate rep ranges. And
Yeah.
that's often forgotten that we actually do have quite a bit of data in that space.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think about that all the time, even in just training. People are like, there's not data on women. I'm like, then why in the training studies we do have, do they just respond to these protocols? If they didn't respond, we would see it, right? So that's such a good point that they are adapting. So yeah.
Yeah, I did a check this week. There's currently around 18,000 studies on women using resistance training. So
Okay, wow.
it's not that we don't have any. We actually have quite a bit.
I know.
Doc, I've only become aware of your work in recent times in the last few years, but every time I look at the posts that you're putting out and the information you're giving women, it's so sensible, it's sane, it's evidence-based. It makes a lot of sense to me. And I wanted to thank you for the service you're giving women of all age groups everywhere. For those people who aren't following you on social media, where can people find more of your work?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. I try really hard. Women deserve nuance and it's not sexy. And sometimes the heavy science swipe posts aren't as flashy as the 30-second podcast clips that hack your life in a day. But I work really hard because I genuinely want women to have good information. It makes me really frustrated for you guys that you don't have it. So anyway, I appreciate that. And you can find me across the board at Dockless Fitness. I would say most of my female physiology stuff is on Instagram. I have a little bit on my podcast called The Hybrid Lab. It's confusing. If you find me and you come to my page, just know I talk a lot about hybrid training and running and cardio and lifting. But the reality is I call hybrid as health. Most good training programs should include both some component of resistance and cardio. That's really my ethos. And I'll get a lot of women who come to my page and be like, does this count and work the same for menopause or women who don't have training goals? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. It's all the same stuff. I just have to use the flashy terms. So don't get scared away by the ultra marathon, heavy lifting content. It is still the same science that applies to you. So Dockless Fitness on Instagram, the Hybrid Lab, or Dockless Fitness on YouTube is where you'll find most of my stuff. And I have a very exciting project I'm working on that I won't share here, but we'll be coming out with more information on soon. So you will want to follow me because you will be very interested in what I'm cooking up. So
That's great. I honestly think some of the best female fitness advice can be found on your page.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks for coming on board today. I really appreciated this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to the Stronger with Time podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who could benefit. For more insights and to continue our conversations, you can find me on Instagram. The link is in the show notes. Until then, I'll catch you next week for another episode.